All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. We're unpacking a fascinating geopolitical chess match today, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF. Basically, we're looking at a completely new blueprint for how nations interact economically in one of the absolute most critical regions on the planet. So if you're trying to figure out the future of global trade, supply chains, or just international influence in general, you are in exactly the right place. Here's how we're breaking it all down today. First, the geopolitical trade vacuum. Then we'll introduce the IPEF itself, outline its 4 key pillars, weigh the promises against the major challenges, and finally, look at India's specific strategic dilemma. Part 1. The geopolitical trade vacuum. To understand why this even exists, you gotta rewind a bit to the Trump era. The US pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, and that just left people worried. Like, did the US completely lose its economic playbook for Asia? Fast forward to October 2021, President Biden floats the IPEF concept at the East Asia Summit. And then boom, it's officially launched in 2022 at the Quad Summit. The US literally had to find a new vehicle, and fast, to re-engage with East and Southeast Asia. And honestly, that re-engagement couldn't happen fast enough. Why? Because the rest of the world didn't just hit pause. While the US was out of the picture, China really doubled down. They're dominating the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and they even put their hand up to join the CPTPP, which is, ironically, the direct successor to the very trade deal the US just walked away from. So, it leaves us with this massive million-dollar question. How exactly does the US step back into the ring? How do you offer a competitive, compelling alternative without just recycling those old, politically toxic trade agreements? Which brings us to part 2. Introducing the IPEF. Now, the sheer scale of this thing is wild. The 12 member countries, and we're talking heavy hitters like Australia, India, Japan, South Korea, plus several ASEAN nations, they represent 40% of the entire global GDP. 40%. That is a massive chunk of the world economy teaming up with the stated goal of tackling things like resilience, sustainability, and economic growth. But here's the real twist, and it's actually kind of brilliant. Participation isn't all or nothing. It operates on an a la carte model. So instead of a traditional rigid treaty where you have to swallow the whole menu, countries can pick and choose which specific initiatives they want to join. But there is a catch. Once you enroll in a module, you are fully on the hook for all of its commitments. So totally flexible to enter, but strict adherence once you're in. Moving on to part 3, the 4 key pillars. Let's crack open that menu. The framework is built on 4 distinct pillars, and the way they divide the labor is super interesting. The trade pillar, which is all about high standard, fair trade, and digital data flows, that's run by the U.S. Trade Representative. But then look at the other 3, supply chain resilience, clean energy, and tax and anti-corruption. Those fall straight under the purview of the U.S. Department of Commerce, and they are laser-focused on the nitty-gritty stuff, like securing critical minerals, mobilizing green finance, and seriously cracking down on money laundering. Part 4. Promises and major challenges. Okay, let's talk about the upside first, because the promises here are huge. For starters, this is the first real multilateral push specifically designed to bulletproof our supply chains. Think about the crazy shortages we had recently with semiconductors and raw materials. The goal here is to stop that from happening again, which should actually help cool down global inflation. Strategically, it gives U.S. companies a much-needed, structured off-ramp if they're trying to shift manufacturing out of China. And on the diplomatic front, it's undeniably a win. 7 out of 10 ASEAN countries and 11 out of 15 RCEP nations signed up right at launch. That shows a serious regional appetite for this kind of alternative. But, and you knew there was a but coming, when you look under the hood, there is a massive structural challenge. The IPEF is not a traditional trade agreement. Usually, those agreements offer market access and /tariffs, right? But to do that in the US, you need Congress to sign off. The IPEF? It offers 0 traditional market access and 0 tariff cuts. Basically, it's framed as an administrative arrangement, so it can totally bypass Congress, which naturally leads critics to ask, wait, does this thing actually have the economic teeth to force countries into deep, long-term compliance? And we have to mention another major critique here impartially. A lot of analysts look at this and say, look, this isn't really about economics. It's being driven entirely by security concerns. The biggest piece of evidence they point to? Taiwan. Despite completely fitting the bill on economic merits and literally asking to join, Taiwan was left out. For the critics, that's a glaring sign that geopolitical caution, specifically not aggravating China, is trumping
pure economic strategy. Which brings us to part 5, India's strategic dilemma.
Let's look at how this plays out for a crucial partner like India, because the IPEF actually creates some really tricky domestic hurdles for them. Take the trade pillar, for instance. It pushes for open, cross-border digital data flows, but that bumps right up against India's own plans to strictly regulate data at home. On top of that, they're pretty hesitant to align their tax policies with a US-backed global standard. Throw in some incredibly strict labor standards, which India kind of uses a sneaky non-tariff barrier holding back their own economic growth, and suddenly, that a la carte model we talked about, it makes total sense. It's basically a necessity for a country trying to juggle international partnerships without giving up its domestic sovereignty.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with something to chew on. Are we witnessing the actual end of traditional free trade agreements? With the IPEF stepping up, it really feels like the old days of just trading market access for lower tariffs are over. We're stepping into this whole new era where things like supply chain security, data regulations, and geopolitical alliances are the real drivers of the economy. The playbook has absolutely changed, and honestly, how countries navigate this new a la carte menu is going to define global trade for decades to come.